Now, recently I was doing the 240Z taillight LED panel, the sequential panel, and it had these really nice little pigtails that you just push into a bulb holder and then you twist it, like the bulb socket inside the taillight. Now I had a couple of them that I'd actually chopped off of a set of Evo 10 headlights, but I wired them on backwards, and it got me thinking this is the perfect opportunity to just show you a couple different options that you have for cutting and soldering wire back together. A couple things to show you before we start cutting and soldering is that I've got a blue wire going to a red one and a black wire going to a black one. I would think that this black wire was ground because black is typically ground, and that this outer one, the blue one, is a power wire, but in fact it's the opposite. So when I soldered this thing together, I just used kind of like the wire colors and assumed that I knew what a wire did based on what color it was. Don't do that. That's not a smart way to go. You really need to actually know what things are before you solder them on there. And if you look, I've got a really nice solder connection on this that has a little bit of glue coming out the side, and that's because I used some marine heat shrink. So I'm going to talk about two different types of heat shrink that you can do, as well as electric tape. I'm just going to demo all of it and show you what it looks like when you do each one of these three things. All right? Now, to make this extremely easy, I'm going to use a product that I cannot get these guys to hit me back, but I love their product. So Quad Hands, if you watch this, I definitely want to keep promoting these products because they're really cool. So when you solder, a lot of times it's hard to keep track of all the crap, the wires, the solder itself, just everything, it gets all over the place. It's a mess. But if you have something like one of the multiple units available from Quad Hands, it does make things easier. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna chop these wires right now. And then after I do that, we're gonna strip them and then we're gonna hang them up on here to make them really easy to solder back together in just a bit. Doing marine heat shrink is definitely gonna be a lot more involved because of that glue. You basically have to just cut all of it off because the heat shrink will not just slide off anymore. So let me strip this blue wire, which, as I have kind of already alluded to, is our ground wire. And then this dude, which actually fell out when I took it off, we're gonna strip that one down there too. Okay, so I just stripped the wire. There's another way that I'm gonna do the next wires, which I don't recommend. Get yourself a set of wire strippers because it's gonna make things easier. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tin the wire. That means I'm gonna take a hot soldering iron, I'm gonna put it to the tip of this, run solder to it, and it's just gonna have solder that is now attached to that wire. It's gonna make it easier to join it to the other wire afterwards. Speaking of the other wire, let's take a look at this heat shrink. That is not coming off no matter what. It started off as what I'm gonna show you in a second, a 3-to-1 heat shrink, meaning it shrinks down by 3 times the size. It'll get 3 times skinnier just by hitting it with the heat gun. The typical kind of heat shrink is 2-to-1, which means it's only gonna shrink by half. You're gonna pay a lot more money for the marine heat shrink. Now here's 2 different types of heat shrink. The blue one is a regular 2-to-1 with no glue inside, and then this black has the glue inside. This is marine heat shrink, so that's going to be much more expensive than this stuff. And the difference is basically just that this is a little bit easier to work with, especially if you have to take it off. So I'm going to show you what it looks like when I try to heat this up and take it off in just a bit. But before, we're just going to actually do the tinning on here, and then I'm going to use this heat shrink as opposed to the other, and we'll take a look at the difference. This is leaded solder that I'm using right here, so it's actually much easier to work with than the lead-free. I actually tried to film working with the lead-free to give 2 different examples. Screw that, it was freaking hard. I couldn't have a nice, easy, understandable video if I was doing it that way. Now I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna strip these 2 wires, but instead of using my wire stripper right now, what a lot of times people do when they're stripping wires is they will use crimpers like this. And you kind of squeeze down a little bit, plant your finger, and then pull away. And I can feel that as it pulled away, some of the little strands kind of got like pinched down a little bit too hard. And what can happen is, that one actually came out super clean. But what can happen is when there's any sort of a weakness right here from crimping down on it, and then you add solder to it, now it's got a point of failure. So we don't want that. So I'm literally just gonna cut the ends off and use my wire stripper on these because I don't wanna have my connection fail where I've soldered just because I didn't use the right tool to do it. I am just going to take a freshly stripped end of the wire here and just add my solder to it, and now it is tinned. So the idea is that we're going to take two different pieces of wire that have solder already on them, and because of that it's going to be that much easier to join them together. Now I'm going to use this 2-to-1 heat shrink really quick. What I want to do is just demonstrate how easy it is if you ever have to undo it. So let's just say that I didn't realize that this blue wire was actually my ground. And let's say that I soldered the two wires together because I've got the leaded solder liquefied and got all good to go. And then I'm sliding this dude over and I'm gonna hit it with the heat gun and it's gonna shrink up around that joint. So now this is a nice, safe joint. It's got the solder joined in the middle. There's no big sharp spots, but I didn't use the marine heat shrink. And because of that, if I need to remove it, got the little heat shrink just split at the bottom. I'm just gonna pull up on it and it basically just splits right in half. Very easy to do so. It's not a super difficult thing to break. But the marine, that's a completely different story. And if I don't heat up this heat shrink, it's gonna be a lot harder to work with. I can't just do like I did on the blue heat shrink because that glue is acting as extra strength for it as well. So instead of it just tearing, it's like holding onto the wire for dear life. So definitely, if you do use marine heat shrink, you're gonna want to heat it up first. I'm struggling to get this thing off right now. If I hit it with the heat gun for a second. Now, I'm gonna be able to just tear it straight off. So just a little bit more involved if you need to remove heat shrink that has marine, you definitely want to heat it up. All right, now speaking of the marine heat shrink, I'm just gonna take an unused piece of it right here, slide it down, and now we're gonna solder this bad boy up, knowing that our blue is actually the ground. I can actually come through and I'm just holding one of them in place and I'm gonna get them to lay nice and flat. And in just a second, it actually at least cools down to the point where it's not liquid anymore, but it's still nice and hot to the touch. So if you slide the marine heat shrink in place too soon because of that glue, it's gonna catch that heat and make it a little bit harder to slide it down into place, whereas the other heat shrink doesn't have nearly the same issue because it'll just slide right over. There's nothing to catch. There's no glue that becomes extra sticky based on the heat, but it can actually start squeezing down on the heat shrink and shrinking it just because that solder joint is still so hot. Let me get this other one done. And this time I'm gonna do a little bit more effort to make sure that our quad hands is super lined up. And that is a really nice joint. Nice and shiny. It's all the way through. You can just see that it's got a really good connection and there's no big sharp points or anything on there. So I'm gonna slide that heat shrink over, and granted, it's not how you would think, black to red and then black to blue over here. It is the way that it needs to be. Now I'm gonna show you another trick that I like to use. This thing is totally good to go and ready. We've got this other side here that I know needs to be redone. A big problem with twisting wires together is that you get a really big bulky connection, right? So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna disconnect these wires, and then I'm gonna show you how big and bulky that section would be if you tried to twist these things together. This is a very common way to connect two wires. So you would twist the two ends together like that, so where they're both coming from the same direction, and then after you would solder on top of it, and after the solder is done, you basically bend that wire over where it's not like this now. Now it's basically like, how do you do this with your hand? It's basically like that. And so you've got this weak point right here where the wire is bent. Now look at this big giant bump that you've got in the middle. I still just don't think that it's worth doing it if it's not saving you a bunch of time, or I don't know, like if it's a super small solder connection, really, really skinny wires, and they're never gonna get tugged on, and it's gonna be the difference between taking like 4 times as long to just lay everything perfectly in place, because it does take a little bit more attention, then yeah, maybe you should do the little twisty method. Now, assuming we got everything all right after changing those things up, hook up ground, power, and there we go. We're all set. And that is never gonna have any sort of issues or get scraped or rubbed on or anything and break that nice bond that it has. Now, to be fair, let's show a good example of like a 26 gauge wire and then I guess a 22 gauge wire. Let's just say that we wanted to do the same idea with heat shrink as the other, but do the twist and fold over method. Then you just take the 2 pieces of wire, aim them up to where the stripped shielding starts at about the same spot, twist them together, and then solder them. And now that little connection, if we have a very thin wire like this 26 gauge, I like to take the thicker one and not fold that one over, but take the thinner one there and then slide our heat shrink over. And that saved a huge amount of time, and this thing doesn't have to be strong, right? It's not ever gonna get tugged on or anything. It's gonna be totally good to go. And if we ever have to undo it, it is annoying. It is harder to undo those kind of connections. But if it's super thin wire, then that means that the solder doesn't have to get completely heated up through like a big chunk, like tons and tons of big thick strands. What it does mean though is that you're almost guaranteed to not be able to really use that little section again. I'm gonna heat it up. It's gonna burn my finger, but it's like I'm kind of trying to straighten it out. But like the shielding's all jacked now. Like it's not easy to reuse this little piece now, to be able to twist it back up again. If you had to, like, let's say, move that wire over, it's obviously a way uglier connection now than it was before. And that's one of the things with wire too, is once you start messing with it, now look at that big kind of bulky chunk that we have right there. And maybe if we cut that off, we'll be fine. But hopefully we don't end up losing that structural integrity of that little solder bond. And there we go. So it's not ideal, it's not awesome, but that method can work better on thinner wires. Definitely not that like 18 gauge or 16 gauge. That's definitely too thick to do it that way. All right, here's our last situation. This is the Diode Dynamics Tailless turn module, and it's kind of been wired to some other stuff. I've been playing with it. But let's say that I want to access the wires that are right here. And I don't want to just cut and strip the ends. I just want to solder, let's say, directly to this black wire right here. Well, one of the options is that you can just make a little strip mark on there, but not use the tool to like rip apart the wire, because it can cut right through, because the metal on this is definitely sharper than my fingernails, hopefully. Anyway, so I just kind of stripped it and I just spread that apart with my fingernails there. And now let's say I want to solder to this wire. So I'm going to go ahead and solder to this, but because I can't fit heat shrink down the side of it, this is a perfect opportunity to use some electric tape. All right, so let's say this is the wire that I'm going to solder to it. And all that I want to do is I want to take this wire that I have here that's going to go to whatever, and then I want to wrap it around that. So I can bring, depending on which way I want the wire to go, I could bring the wire up from the bottom or the other side. And I can just wrap that metal on metal right around at that joint, make sure that it's nice and solid. And then instead of just taping that, which is what I see boneheads do all the freaking time, solder that thing. Make sure that the solder connection is nice and secure. And in this case, I can see that there's a little piece sticking up. And right now it's not soldered, so that's not going to be all sharp and stab me or anything. So I'm going through, adding my solder right now. And then one other big piece of advice is you don't want to just tear this stuff by hand. I see people do that all the time, because what it's going to do, if I just stretch this thing all out, is when it gets heated up later, that's going to respond to that heat, that weird kind of like stretched out section. that's not any good. We don't want the tape to fail later. So make a good clean cut mark. It's also going to make it easier if you ever have to find that cut mark and open this tape up. Just cut a little piece, don't ball it up all giant and huge. And even this is just like way too much. So if I want, I'm actually going to even trim this down further. Wrap it around a couple times. I don't need all that extra, but if you've got this little wrapped section right here, now that's safe. It's not going to come into contact with anything. We've got a nice solid sturdy connection and it's not going to rip. Doesn't matter which way I pull on it. And hopefully if we taped it and we have a nice seam on there, then it's not gonna, even in like hot weather, just gonna like come undone. But I will say that I hate electric tape because of this goo. It's so much better to just have a nice soldered connection on there. But in this case, it would take way more time to completely depin this thing if we don't have the right tools, slide everything out, and then add a little piece of heat shrink and then slide that pin back in there. That's a little bit idealistic and overkill. So this is a great example of when using electric tape is better than using heat shrink. And there's our 3 ways. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you tomorrow.